Hi, I'm Henry, the sewing pattern designer from Sew Willow. I'm getting married in May to my fiance Steve, and being a pattern designer, it kind of makes sense that I'm going to try and make my own dress. I knew that I wanted something not too traditional, but I wanted to have the kind of like narrow waist and really supported bust area. I've always wanted to make a corset, so I thought this would be a really good opportunity to also learn some new skills. I generally tend to make things just like dresses and trousers, but making a wedding dress is a new experience, and I thought maybe I will take you guys on a journey with me through this process. So for me, it starts from the foundations. And I've never made a corset before. I've never even worn a corset before. And I did a lot of research about what kind of corset I wanted and the kind of construction I wanted to do. And in the end, I settled on the Pretty Housemaid pattern designed by Clockwork Fairy. So it's based on the Pretty Housemaid pattern that was made by Symington's here in not far away from me, 20 minutes away from me in Marker Harbour. And there was a corset factory based there. But in the meantime, so here is the corset. I'm really pleased with how this turned out, especially as it's my first ever corset. It fits me amazingly well. I mean, it fits me a lot better than it does the mannequin. The mannequin is a bit different in size to me as well. Her bust area is about the same as mine. As you can see, I am much hippier than the mannequin is. The waist, when I'm wearing the corset, kind of goes to about this size. There's still a little bit of room here, but the hips are significantly bigger than the mannequin. So it shouldn't affect the dress in this instance, but I'll mostly be doing those fittings on myself anyway. So here's the back of the corset. I will be using different laces. This is just my first ribbons that I've added in. I've started with some of the flossing. I still need to finish that, but generally speaking, really pleased with it. And because this is the corset I will be wearing underneath my dress on the day, it's going to make it a lot easier for me to fit the wedding dress. As a starting point, I used this dress that I bought maybe about 10 years ago now when we lived down in Lewis in East Sussex. They have some amazing antique shops down there. And I found this, which is a wedding dress. I think I paid about £75 for it. It fits me really beautifully, actually. It fits me almost perfectly around the waist. It's a little bit big around the bust area, and I'm not so keen on the bust shaping, but it fits me beautifully around the waist. So for me, this was almost like a starting point of the shaping I want. I think what I love most is the skirt, the drape of the skirt, just how wide the skirt goes. This is made from a really beautiful silk brocade, and it's quite heavy in some ways. I haven't gone for the same fabric, but I think just the shaping is so lovely on this. I photographed a bunch of dancers in this, so this is well worn, needs a little bit of TLC, and I might sell it. So the corset itself is made with cotton couture, which is the base layer, and then over the top I've used a satin. I think the fact that this is satin on the outside will mean that the fabric from the dress will drape really beautifully over this and will sit without kind of bunching up. So here's quite a big reveal for me, which is one of the first and foremost important things, is that I have already bought my fabric. I wanted something a little bit sheer, but then have a silk underneath. And I wanted something with like a little bit of embroidery to add that texture and to add a bit of whimsy. It's bought from a fabric shop called Akriti in India. And they especially dyed the silk for me to match the outer layer of fabric perfectly. And although it's got great drape, it hasn't got much structure to it. So I will be lining the bodice with a cotton. I think I'm just going to go for really lightweight cotton that will allow me to attach the boning to it. And it's probably only going to be in the bodice. And the bodice will be done with an underlining, because when you're wearing a corset, you don't really need a lining as such because you haven't got anything against your skin. So it's not like the seam allowances being visible on the inside is going to affect the wearability of it, because that will all be sitting against the corset, which is another reason why I've decided to go for a corset under the dress rather than doing corsetry inside of the dress. And also I figured then I can always wear the corset again. So for the over fabric, this is the bit I'm most excited to show you, is this absolutely beautiful embroidered fabric with roses. And it is a Chandari fabric from India. I just love this kind of sheer fabric that they have there quite a lot. And it drapes really well. I think, it'll be really nice on the bodice. So the very first step for me in making my dress was to make the corset. Once I had the corset, I then took some calico fabric, and the calico fabric I started to drape and cut according to the bodice shape I want. So what I wanted to do was to get this shape to have almost a little bit of a sweetheart neckline, And then from here, there's going to be a little drape sleeve either side. One thing I'm a little bit conscious of is the fact that I don't want this to sit as low because the corset's quite low, but I want it to sit a little bit above and just cover me a little bit at the top because the corset does push everything upwards. I've decided to go for a nice seam here and here because I'm thinking maybe I might not do this. I'm thinking of doing embroidery along these seams, and then on the back of the bodice it's just going to be a really simple placket closure with hooks and eyes. The corset has got metal boning. I want to add boning to the bodice, and it's going to be really lightweight feather light boning, so I'm going to add a bone line right here to keep this point up, and I'll probably have to bend it in a little bit, and then there's going to be another boning in there, and then on the back of the bodice I'm going to add just boning channels to here and here, and I think I'm going to do one here again where I want this section to cover the corset to stick up and to drape the sleeve around. I am going to film the process as I go along, and I'll do a voiceover, and I will hopefully take you on a journey with me, show you a couple of my fittings, and fingers crossed, today's a big day. This is the first full day I've got to properly work on this project, so here goes. As you've seen, I've already cut the mock-up bodice, so now it's time for me to lay out and cut the mock-up skirt panels. Again, I'm using calico so that I can drape the pattern pieces before cutting my actual fabric. As the skirt and waist of the vintage wedding dress fits me well, I'm literally just going to trace these panels as they are. You can see here how I'm now checking the bodice waistline measurements against the waistline measurements for the skirt. Taking into consideration the skirt will have 2 small pleats at the front and 2 at the back as per the vintage dress skirt. I only need to cut 1 skirt panel pattern because all 4 sides of the skirt will be mirrored around the waist. Now I can check my calico bodice and skirt panel against the corset to make sure it will fit the waist circumference of the corset, which I have tried to lace according to my waist measurement. I quickly realized that it's important to have my mannequin at the same shoulder height as me. Happy with the fit of the skirt pattern, I now had to check that it would actually fit on the length of my fabric, leaving me enough fabric for the bodice and sleeves. I was very relieved to see that the estimated 7 meters of fabric was plenty to cut 4 pieces of skirt panels plus the side corners. This was by far the scariest part. I decided to prioritize cutting the skirt panels from the fabric first so that I can use as much fabric as I needed on the bodice. To cut the mirrored front skirt panel, I wanted the motifs offset so that they didn't seem too obviously mirrored. I used the unembroidered panel near the selvage edge to ensure I didn't have to cut into any embroidery for the front central seam. I repeated this method for the back skirt panels. Now it was time to start cutting the bodice pieces. First the underlining from my plain cotton fabric. Then for the chandari fabric, I wanted each bodice panel to have a mindfully placed embroidered motif, without trying to pattern match the motifs. I did this by placing my pattern pieces underneath the right side of the fabric until I found a motif placement I liked. I cut the center back panels near the unembroidered selvage edge so that I didn't have bulky embroidered motifs near the placket side. Here you can see how I decided to cut the motif placements for each front bodice panel. So in order to start sewing the boning channels, I had read a tip online about sewing a strip of wadding on the base of the boning channel to soften the edges of the boning when the boning channel does not sit alongside a seam. So this is what I'm doing here. I'm cutting strips of cotton wadding with pinking shears. To further soften the boning channels, I have also cut my cotton boning channel strips with the pinking shears to avoid the visibility of any boning channel lines from the outside of the bodice. And then I sewed the boning strips onto the underlining of the bodice. As well as cutting these same bodice panels from my silk lining, I then sandwiched the silk lining between the underlining and chandari fabrics, pressed them and pinned them together. Once pinned, I used a zigzag stitch along the edges of the panels to sew the layers together and prevent further fraying. And then it was time to start joining the panels with right sides facing along the seam edges. And here's a first look at how the bodice panels are coming along. I'm checking now to see where else I may need to add boning channels, even though I won't be using steel wire boning inside the garment. I'm really pleased to see that the wadding has indeed helped to disguise the boning channels from the outside. Here you can see what the inside of the bodice looks like at this stage, including the boning channels. With all the panels sewn together, it's time for my first fitting. I'm pinning the bodice on back to front and then spinning it around. Once in place, I tuck and pin the top edge to see where I should hem the neckline. And finally, just a quick play around with some offcuts to see if a drape sleeve would work. I'm pretty pleased with this. So whilst the bodice has pieced together fairly quickly, it's at this point that I start doing a lot of hand sewing. First, I start playing around with embroidery on the seams based on a sketch. I've used silk threads and some fairly basic embroidery techniques to create running stitches, feather stitching, leaves, and tiny roses to give that texture and interest to the seams. And I'm using a tablecloth on my lap to prevent getting the delicate fabric dirty. I love how this is looking at this point, and I'm so pleased I've gone ahead with the embroidery. Here you can see how the inside of the bodice looks with the seams and the boning channels, which were sewn to the underlining. But now I need to add extra boning channels along the seams. I'm using a twill tape from my local haberdashery shop, Darnet, and I'll be sewing this directly into the seam allowances. Now I'm also adding in the boning channels for the back placket before folding and sewing the edges of the placket over. And then it's the internal placket strip. I also want to take a moment to show that whenever pressing seams, I use a spare square of white linen fabric to avoid burning and over flattening the embroidery on the chandari fabric. And finally, it's time to hem the top of the bodice with an interfacing. So I'll begin by tracing the top of my bodice pieces. And then I mark how deep I want to make the facings. The facings are made from the silk lining backed with a soft iron-on interfacing. Having sewn the facings together, I then sewed it into the neckline before carefully turning over and pressing. Time for a mannequin fit. At this point, I've learned to stuff some wadding into the hips of the corset to match my measurements. Here you can see how the back placket works with the boning channels keeping the back closure taut. At this stage, I actually really feel like I can see where I'm starting to go with the dress. Happy with the fit, I'm now pressing the neckline before hand stitching the facing edges to the underlining of the bodice with a whip stitch. For my metal hook closures, instead of using the metal loops, I'm hand sewing thread loops with a thick cotton thread that perfectly matches my fabric. This is such a satisfying technique. With the bodice pretty much all sewn up, I can finally fit it to the corset, start playing with the sleeves and think about attaching the skirt. Although I originally cut out my skirt panels from the outer chandari fabric, it's only at this point that I'm cutting the silk lining for the skirt. But the silk is pretty slippery and I don't want that to affect the drape or length of the skirt. So I'm going ahead and starching the silk fabric before cutting my skirt panel. I'm sewing the skirt lining panels together using French seams and a walking foot to prevent the silk slipping. The makers of the vintage dress must also have been working with narrow fabric. They added these side triangles to the skirt panels. Although these seams will be visible, I do want these panels to pattern match, and I think I have enough fabric left to try and find a match for each side. Once again, as with the silk lining, for all my skirt panel joining, I'm using French seams. Time consuming, but a must when using sheer fabric. Okay, so here I'm just pinning my skirt panels to the bodice to make sure I get the pleats and the fit right. I'm really excited about joining the skirt. And now for the skirt lining. I've already sewn the whole skirt lining and left a gap at the back for closing. Next over the top is the outer skirt. So now I can start marking the waist with pins and securing the pleats to match the seams on the bodice. With the waistline marked, I'm turning the bodice inside out to pin to the skirt and then another fit before I sew. So you can see here how uneven my first attempt is. So now I'm working on the mannequin to adjust the waistline join with the pins. At this point, I had already decided to do a basque waistline on the back of the dress, but I actually wanted just a soft curve around the front. But the more I'm pinning, the more I'm naturally forming a subtle basque waistline on the front of the bodice too. And so I'm deciding to just go with the flow of the process. So I've just sewn the skirt in using a long stitch length for easy unpicking, and now I'm trying on the full dress for the first time. I do really like the overall fit, and although it's hard to tell when the waistline's not yet pressed, without any gathering on the hips, I'm just not so keen on the transition from waist to hip. So I've consulted with my niece and my sister and decided to play around with adding a kind of bustle that will attach over the top of the waistline. Luckily, I have just about enough fabric to do this, and I already really like what this adds to the waist shaping. I don't really want to train because for our wedding we'll be walking amongst the streets of Puglia in Italy, and I really like the idea of just having the bustle gathered at the back. So we're currently halfway through March and we're leaving for Italy on the 1st of May. I decided it's time to make a list of things to do to finish the dress in time. First on the list is to secure the skirt to the waistline, and I get straight onto that. Success, it's starting to come together now. Number 2 on my list is to finish the back opening of the skirt to match the bodice placket. I tried sewing a placket for this part, but it just didn't hang right, so I decided I'm just folding, pressing and hand stitching it from the inside. Also, I'm not obsessing over this because I already know the bustle will cover the back of the skirt. That's the advantage of sewing for yourself. Nobody else will know or care what the inside of the dress will look like. Number 3 on my list is to secure the gathers on the bustle. I decide to cut a bias strip from my silk lining, which I sew over the gathered raw edge and then turn under. And then, as though making a wedding dress wasn't complicated enough, I decide the sports bra that my damaged mannequin, well actually I should say dress form, wears to cover up damage from her previous life is interfering with how I view my dress. And what's holding me back from making the sleeves is the lack of shoulders and arms, not procrastination. So here I am mending and sewing arms for my dress form. So as it turns out, the arms really were worth doing, and I can finally start the sleeves. I decided to pleat the sleeves and make the pattern using linen fabric, which will hold the pleats well. Once I have the pattern shape, I start cutting the fabric. At this point, I'm going to nervously confess that I have almost no scraps of outer fabric left, so there's very little room for error. This is the point where the hand sewing marathon begins. I've decided that I want all my hems to be rolled hems done by hand. Luckily, it's still pretty cold and dark in the UK, so I tend to do most of the handwork in the evenings in front of the TV. Firstly, I decide to hem the edges of the sleeves. Then I pin and press the pleats of the sleeves. I'm pressing the fabric directly, but only within the seam allowances. Then I secure the pleats with a line of machine stitching and bind the raw edge with silk bias strips. Once I pin the sleeves to the bodice, it's time for another fitting. And as we're eloping by ourselves to Italy, this will be the way I put my dress on the day. This is also the first time I'm trying the bustle on myself. So I'm marking where the hooks need to go that will secure the bustle to the waist. I also still haven't hemmed the bustle, which was actually number 4 on my list. It's during this fitting that I realized I'm not 100% happy with the front seam on the skirt. So as well as taking the embroidery on the bodice down to the waistline, I've decided to also add a line of feather stitch embroidery down the entire front seam of the skirt, so that the seam looks like a decorative extension of the basque waistline point. Much happier with the front seam, I now realize that the dress tends to slip down the smooth satin corset when worn. So as I suspected, I'm adding hooks to the inside side seams of the dress and metal eyes to the corset so that the bodice will effectively hang on the corset and not shift around. I also decided to hand sew cups to the inside of the dress underlining to ensure the fabric sits smoothly over the lower bust, which with this shape of corset is slightly flattened. Finally, I jump back to number 4 on my list, which is to hem the bustle and add hooks. When I purchased my silk embroidery threads, I also purchased some pale pink pure silk ribbon from the same shop, which I'm hoping will be less visible through the dress, as the silk ribbon is very fine. So finally, here is the order of garments I'll be wearing on the wedding day. Except I didn't show the chemise, which is a very fine layer of muslin I'll wear next to my skin. Over the chemise, I start with a corset, over which comes my cotton petticoat. Then there's this borrowed petticoat from Katie at Honeycomb's Vintage, and then the dress. You can see here how I'm hooking the side seams onto the corset. And of course, last of all, there's the bustle. With 3 weeks to go, all that was left now was step 6, which was to hem the skirt. After doing a rolled hem by hand of the outer fabric, I had to tackle the silk lining. As the silk lining fabric isn't sheer, I did a narrow rolled hem on the machine. Ready for the big reveal? How did I like my dress on the day? I loved it. It was worth every moment. But I'm also glad I didn't make too big a deal of the project, tried to be too much of a perfectionist or spend too much money on it. I mean, all in all, the cost of the fabrics, silk threads and corset supplies came to more than what I could have paid for a ready-made off-the-peg synthetic fabric dress from an online retailer, but less than a custom-made gown from embroidered fabric and pure silk. The dress turned out slightly more princess-like than I had imagined, but I kind of just allowed my creativity to lead me, and I have loved the process and I have absolutely no regrets. So if you're thinking of making your own wedding dress, then I hope this inspires you. If you enjoyed this video, please click the like button and follow my channel for more sew along and even knit along videos. You can purchase my sewing and knitting patterns from sewwillow.com and from my Etsy store.